Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Federal Councillor, esteemed colleagues. This proposal aims to instruct the Federal Council to demonstrate the value of the bilateral agreements for Switzerland. One could also say that the FDP wants to burden the administration with another report while we are desperately trying to reduce the costs of the federal administration in this very session. 2001, well, aside from that, this is a dishonest initiative. Everything strongly indicates that the Federal Council and the EU will most likely announce the conclusion of the negotiations on the framework agreement this month, probably next week. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, indeed, this is a very important framework agreement, precisely an institutional submission to the esteemed and significant European Union. So it's dishonest, Mr. Michel, when you talk about package solutions and bilateral 3 now. I was in Brussels myself. The people at the EU emphasize that these are no longer bilateral agreements between Switzerland and the EU. You just have to read the common understanding. Already in the first point, Article 1, it states that the entire agreement is aimed at being an institutional solution. And you know what has been documented in the common understanding? The chief negotiator, Patrick Franzen, was not even allowed to discuss anymore. That was basically set in stone. Why do you want a report on the bilateral agreement's value if you're working to abolish them? You and your party should request a report showing where your path leads. Why seek a report on agreements' value if ending them? Consider adopting EU laws, facing penalties, accepting EU court rulings, and paying the EU. If you are indeed simultaneously working day and night to completely and thoroughly abolish them, then I have to tell you, you and your party would have been better off requesting a thorough and detailed report that shows where the path you are trying to take leads. Namely, that we will have to automatically adopt EU law in important economic and social matters, that we will be penalized if we do not comply with European law, that we must accept the European Court of Justice as final and binding in legal interpretation. And finally, that we will still have to send money to the EU in Brussels for the privilege of buying 20 billion more from them each year. So I ask you, Hein, to reject this dishonest proposal. It's unnecessary. We would then be happy to make another proposal, namely that we want to know what this agreement, this submission contract, actually means for Switzerland. Mr. Grüter, when they speak here in the hall, their first sentence is, I am indeed an entrepreneur and I truly act economically. Why don't they want to determine the economic value of the bilateral agreements? You're not an entrepreneur? I can simply put it this way, inform you, when I see, even in my professional field, you know I come from the IT industry, from my professional perspective, when I see what the European Union passes and enacts as incredibly bureaucratic monstrosity laws that lead to innovation being hindered, hampered, and obstructed, that new products are not even being introduced by large tech companies any longer or anymore because the laws are so utterly, completely, and entirely absurd and extreme, I must say we in Switzerland are doing well. I'm not saying we don't need regulation, but if we can continue to make our own decisions, where we might even, in fact, take over regulation, then we decide. And that's why I believe that we are indeed also acting in the interest of the economy when we take our own path. I definitely don't want equal stakes, I want longer stakes.
Ms. Arslan, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Grüter, for your remarks. Now, it is the case that you and your party are determined to hold a referendum, if possible mandatory, on this issue of 2021. And with the review of such a report and with the presentation of the foundations, we would have actually created the basis for this concern. Are you against us creating the foundations now? And what kind of referendum should we pursue? Thank you.
So the referendum will be about the question of whether we want such a subjugation agreement or not. and not about whether the value of the bilateral agreements is good or bad. There are already reports on this, Mr. Michel is right, but they are not the latest reports. But I believe that when the referendum comes, hopefully it will be mandatory. Anything else would be inappropriate. The question, is there another question? Another follow-up question is posed by Ms. Schneider-Taylor.
Yes, Mr. colleague Grüter, I appreciate you very much. You are a clever man. But it actually disappoints me. You don't know what bilateral means. Bilateral agreements are two-sided agreements. That you do not allow the Federal Council to evaluate the added value of these bilateral agreements disappoints me. Why are you doing that?
Yes, you said it right. Bilateral agreements are contracts made on equal terms. And when I sign a rental agreement with you, don't want you to be able to unilaterally impose what should apply anew at the end. 1,000. So from that perspective, I know what the bilaterals are and what they are not. And for that, no new report is needed.
Esteemed Madam President, Mr. National Councillor Grüter, it was said that there will be a referendum vote. Don't you also think that they need to decide on this in Parliament first, before it's clear whether there will even be a referendum?
Of course, it will and must come to Parliament first. I strongly assume that it will be. But afterwards, I think it's quite clear that the Swiss people absolutely need to say yes or no to this subjugation agreement, and that from my perspective and ours, a mandatory referendum is absolutely necessary. I firmly believe that with such an important state treaty, this question shouldn't even arise. Thank you very much.